Hey fellow tacticians, be sure to like this video and subscribe and ring that little notification bell. That supports this channel's conservative content, which is good for me, good for you, good for America, but really bad for the dark cyber overlords at YouTube. This lesson is going to primarily focus on the book of Genesis. Now, it was an interesting thing, and I kind of hinted at this last week when we were talking about the massive wealth of knowledge that comes from the Old Testament when it comes to prophecies. And based on how the Bible defines prophecy, you could look at almost the entirety of the Old Testament as a messianic prophecy. However, I'm going to stick to my promise of only covering the ones that are overt prophecies and talking about that we see through divine revelation in the Old Testament, where God specifically puts out an idea of the prophecy of the coming of his son. So instead of just looking at specifically allegories and things that are parallel to Jesus' story, we're only going to focus on the ones where he overtly says this. But even with keeping to that parameter, the book of Genesis has a lot to offer in those regards as well. And so even though we're going to try to limit our scope as much as possible for the sake of time and to try to get as much out of it as we can, just be aware of the fact that, unfortunately, I am having to skip over quite a bit when we're going through this study in Genesis, because the book of Genesis itself could have been, Messianic Prophecies in Genesis could have been a 13-week class by itself. So just be aware of that as we're going through the text this evening. But we are going to get started right there at the beginning. So we're going to go ahead and read Genesis 3, verses 14 through 15. And of course, the context of this particular story is that this is going to be the origin point of the Messianic prophecies in many ways. So we're starting right at the beginning, and this is right after the fall of man, and so this is right after the fall narrative. So Genesis 3, 14 through 15. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Now, this is a passage that most of us, I'm assuming, are very familiar with. This is something that we've probably read many, many times over the years in our Christian walk and our desire to understand more about this. And I'm going to go ahead and give you the traditional understanding of this messianic prophecy. I know that it's something we probably all already know, but this is kind of the way that most people understand this. First of all, the serpent, most people attribute that to being Satan. So there are some schools of thought that say the serpent is just a serpent. It's just another animal hanging out there in the garden. But at this point, the animals could communicate with Adam and Eve. And because of that, this is just a serpent tempting Eve. It is not actually the spiritual entity of Satan. You'll also see people talk about the seed being the Messiah. So this could be a prophecy looking forward to the day when the Messiah is going to bruise the head of Satan in the traditional sense. And then also this prediction that Satan is going to injure him, but he is going to destroy the serpent. And so part of the reason that this interpretation is part of the way that people understand this verse is because obviously bruising the heel, something that's annoying, something that you don't enjoy, it is an injury for sure. But at the same time, that's very different than bruising someone's head. If you attack someone's head, that is something that could very easily be a mortal wound, a blow that could kill you. And so because of that, the head injury is significantly more serious than an injury to the heel. And so this is how people generally have understood this messianic prophecy, that they look at it and say, okay, what's going to happen is at the cross, Satan is going to bruise God. He is going to injure the Son of Man. And then in turn, through that death, through that injury, the Messiah is going to conquer death and bruise the head of Satan in sort of a mortal wound kind of way, in a way that he will never have the power that he did beforehand, because mankind now has access to salvation. So that's sort of the traditional understanding of the messianic prophecy. However, there are different schools of thought on this particular passage. Some people do interpret it somewhat differently and say that it's actually, in fact, not a messianic prophecy at all. So one of the possible interpretations is that this is just a description of the struggle between serpents or even reptiles as a whole and humans. which, by the way, on some level does make sense because obviously there is a vast plurality of the human race that understandably does not like snakes. And that's something that has been true for a long time. They're usually concealed under leaves or dirt or something. They're slithery. They're things that we just have a natural aversion to, and that is done for our own survival. Snakes are dangerous things, and therefore we have been programmed with an aversion to snakes and reptiles in general because we understand psychologically they pose a threat to us. And so a lot of people will just say the only purpose of the Genesis story here is to suggest that this is humans understanding that they need to be leery of snakes because serpents represent a threat to us and our physical well-being. And so this is just sort of a holdover of ancient paganistic thinking where reptiles are presented as the great adversary of human beings because they do present a threat to us. By the way, this was a view that is not limited to just atheists or people who were scoffers of the text. There are quite a few biblical scholars that do subscribe to this idea. John Calvin and John Walton are two probably the most famous theologians that hold this view that the story's not actually about Jesus. This is not a messianic prophecy. It's just talking about how snakes and humans are natural enemies. And then you also have Rabbi Rashi, who, of course, he is not a Christian himself. And so you can understand why he would not think of this as being talking about Christ. But it is important to note that Jewish scholars do believe in the Messiah, even if they don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. And so Rabbi Rashi could look at this and say, oh, it's a messianic prophecy. It's not about Jesus, but it is a messianic prophecy. But he doesn't do that. He believes that the same way that John Calvin and John Walton did, that this is really just a prophecy or just an explanation in the Bible about why humans and reptiles tend to not get along. There are some people that kind of spiritualize it a little bit, and so they go a little further than the idea of this is just about snakes being nasty and humans not liking them, and say that this is just an allegory for good and evil. And so what they're saying there is, sure, it does go deeper than just snakes bad, but the part that it goes deeper on is it's just predicting this eternal struggle that's going to happen between good and evil throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. So while it's prophetic in a sense, and it's foretelling this struggle between good and evil, it's not actually talking about the Messiah or the person that is to come that is going to save people from their sins, and certainly not Jesus Christ himself. And then there, in looking in this sort of mode of thinking, there is this eternal and equal struggle where they're exchanging mortal blows. So an important part of this particular part of the philosophy is that, well, bruising the heel doesn't seem like a grave injury. However, you have to remember that it's a snake. Snakes are venomous. And because of that, even if a snake bites you on your heel, it can still kill you. And so it may not seem like a big injury, but at the same time, it's still something that could be viewed as a mortal blow. And because of that, then we should view this as good and evil basically being two equal and opposite entities that are constantly clashing with one another. Now, I would actually argue that that's much more akin to Taoism or dualism than it is actual Christian or Jewish theology. But regardless of where you fall on that particular part of the debate, there are people that hold that particular view. And then, of course, there is the idea that I would assume most of us hold, whereas this is a prophecy of the Messiah. And I know that I'm kind of giving away the ending here, but at the same time, this is a class called Messianic Prophecies, and we're talking about this verse, so I'm guessing you probably already figured out that I hold the view that it is a Messianic prophecy. So I do also hold that this is specifically talking about the Messiah and the person of Jesus Christ. But the thing is, this is not just something that, as a lot of the biblical skeptics will pull out, something that Christians just kind of retroactively ascribe to being a messianic prophecy, because there are very early Christian thinkers that held this view as well. For example, Irenaeus, who is only a couple centuries after the death of Christ, we know from his writings that he held the same view of Genesis 3:15 that many modern Christians do, that this is a foretelling of the coming of Jesus Christ. And then we also have Revelation 20, verse 2, which seems to suggest the same thing. You notice it's talking about Satan being the dragon, and it refers to him as the serpent of old. Well, that's a direct reference back to the book of Genesis. It's ascribing this idea that Satan has been a serpent and has been back from the beginning, which is what Revelation is referring to. And so this is not a newfangled idea. People have tried to treat it that way, as though Christians just sort of, backfilled this thing, and they wanted to look for signs of Jesus back in the Old Testament, and so they retroactively pulled things out of context to explain Jesus in the Old Testament. But Irenaeus and the Apostle John obviously didn't feel that way, because we have record of their ascribing this prophecy to Genesis from very, very early on. So this brings us to the big question: who is the seed? Because if you break this question and all these different possible interpretations down to a single idea, that's really the idea that we're dealing with, isn't it? Because if the seed is the Messiah, or if you're a Christian, if the seed is Jesus Christ, that answers all those questions. But if the seed is mankind, or the seed of Eve, or something else entirely, well, then that changes how you interpret the prophecy. And so the big question here is, who is the seed? And so we'll seek to answer that question here tonight. Let's look at Genesis 4, verses 6 through 8. And the reason that I'm going to this story, which may seem unconnected, is because the important thing to understand about the prophecy in Genesis 3, 14, and 15 is that it is establishing a pattern. And so it's not just foreshadowing Jesus, it's also foreshadowing the narratives that are about to come directly after it. And so a narrative pattern is going to be established where we see certain parallels happening between these narratives that are unfolding in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And as always, context is key to understanding not just prophecy, but any piece of biblical literature. So let's go ahead and read that. Genesis 4, verses 6 through 8. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Again, story that we're all familiar with, but there actually are parallels that are drawn specifically between this narrative and the narrative that we saw and the prediction that we saw in Genesis 3, verses 14 through 15. So a couple things I want us to notice here as we're looking through this particular story. And it's important to remember that this is all going to be about the seed that is produced from this. Now, this is crude, and to be honest, it kind of makes me a little uncomfortable to bring this up, but it is in the text, and it pertains to our lesson, so I feel that I have to. It's important to note that in the original Hebrew, the implication of this verse and the imagery that God is using to describe to Cain what he should do, you'll notice that it says there, "and its desire is for you." That particular Hebrew verbiage denotes lust. So it is not just a danger in that this sin, this imagery that's given of a beast that is crouching and desires for you, is not just hunger, but it's also, again, this is kind of crude, but I feel that because it's in the text we have to talk about it, it's kind of a sexual desire as well. And so this is actually an idea that is not completely foreign to biblical literature. And in fact, we see it much later in the New Testament in the book of James, where it talks about when you allow lust to have its way with you, it conceives and gives birth to sin. So we see similar verbiage being used in different parts of the Bible. And the idea is, just like if Cain allows his anger, which God is trying to deal with at this point in the story, if he allows his anger to just have its way with him, then the result of that is going to be sin. We all understand this. And so that's kind of the imagery that is being presented here, that sin is waiting for Cain and it is crouching. It desires to have him and possess him. And then that is going to give birth to sin if Cain does not fight this off. And that's exactly the instruction that God gives him there. So let's look at a little bit later. I know it says Genesis 6 through 8, but this is actually verses 9 through 12. I just forgot to change the heading there. Genesis 4, verses 9 through 12. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done?" The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Now, here's my question to you. We just finished talking about the alternate interpretations of the prophecy and whether or not Genesis 3 is actually about the seed of Eve in the sense that she's going to eventually produce the Messiah, or is it just about the seed of human beings from then on out? Does this seed sound like a righteous seed to you? I mean, Cain is Eve's offspring, and the prophecy specifically said that if it's going to be this big battle between good and evil, that Eve's offspring are presented in the side of good, and then the serpents are presented as the side of evil. So doesn't this kind of blow a pretty big hole in that theory? Because if Cain is her offspring, Cain's not presented as a good guy. And so with that being said, it seems unlikely that that is a correct understanding of the prophecy of Genesis 3, 14, and 15, if this is how the seed of Eve behaves. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the parallels that we notice between these two narratives, because I think it better helps us understand the prophecy that we're looking at here. First of all, God gives very clear instructions. There is no way to misunderstand or misinterpret what God told Adam and Eve and Cain. He told Cain not to give in to his anger and not to act upon it. He told Adam and Eve, do not eat of the tree of the fruit of this specific tree. And so he gives very clear instructions. And then humans, almost immediately, it seems, defy God in his instructions. We know that Eve and then Adam partook of the fruit. And then, of course, Cain does give in to his anger and acts on his impulse and then winds up killing and murdering his own brother. We also see an interesting parallel here that God asked where and why. And so you'll see this in verses 3, 8 through 9 and 13 in the Adam and Eve story, and then 4, 9 through 10, that afterward, after this sin has taken place, God is asking, where are you? Adam, where are you? And then he starts talking to Adam, and he says, well, why have you done this? And we see the same thing happen to Cain. Where's your brother? Why did you do what you did? And so we see these parallels happening, that there's a moral lesson that is supposed to be taught here, that this is how God reacts to sin and deals with them after this sin has taken place. And then we also see a curse follows this disobedience. And so they have clearly defied God's law, and now God is going to curse them for their disobedience. We see that curse is in 13 verse 14, where Eve is cursed because of her disobedience, and that means that she is going to have to endure great pain in childbirth. We also see Adam receives a curse. And he's going to have to toil on the ground, and we also see the serpent is given a curse, that he's going to have to crawl on his belly and be lower than all the other beasts. And we see a similar curse that happens in 4, 10 through 11, where Cain is being punished for his actions that he's taken. And so this actually puts Cain much more in line, at least based on the way that the curse is worded, with the serpent, not with Eve. And so if we're going to look at this as being a lineage, and remember, the Hebrew word for seed and offspring are exactly the same word. There is no distinction between them in the Hebrew. And so because of that, this idea of him being the seed of Eve and being the promised one that is going to bruise the head of the serpent, that doesn't seem to follow with the narrative that we're seeing in Cain's story. And then finally, man is exiled for his disobedience. And so Adam and Eve defied God. They're kicked out of the garden. In the same way, Cain is forced to be a wanderer and roam, and he is not allowed to be in civilization with the rest of mankind. And so exile is the penalty that is given for this particular sin. And then finally, we see a contrast between the good seed and the bad seed, and this is kind of the crux of our argument, where we see God making this distinction between the two. And we also see a distinction that happens in Cain's story as well, because we see that Cain actually does have offspring as well. He has a son named Enoch. By the way, very important to note, this is a very different Enoch than the one we see in Genesis 5. This is not the one that walks with God and is eventually called home, doesn't actually see death. This is a different Enoch. But we see the son of Cain, and he is part of the evil seed. We see the offspring of Seth, when Abel is killed, obviously he can no longer be the seed that is promised. And so we see Seth is being born, and so he is the one through whom the seed is going to follow. So let's go ahead and look at that really quickly. Genesis 4, verses 25 through 26. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another offspring. Again, remember, the word offspring, seed, same word in the Hebrew. In place of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. The men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Well, now that's interesting because we're actually seeing the contrast between an evil seed and a good seed. Nothing good is said about the offspring of Cain, but we're seeing something positive attributed to the offspring of Seth, where it says that the men began to call on the name of the Lord. So here's my question. Why did she need another child? If she already had the offspring of Cain, then why does she need another child to replace him? I think there's something to that. For those of you who couldn't hear Daniel, he was saying you needed a good seed to come from that. And so the lifestyle that Cain has had to adopt now is not conducive to producing good seed anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that if your parents are bad, you're doomed to, be bad yourself. I don't think that the Bible teaches that at all. But the point is, God clearly makes a distinction, and remember that God can see into the future. That the best chance that he has for creating a good seed is going to be through not Cain, but another offspring that is going to come. And this is going to set up this dichotomy that we're going to see throughout the book of Genesis, that there are these two brothers, whether that's literally or symbolically, good and evil, and one is going to beget good food or good fruit, and the other is not going to do that. Sometimes it's not even necessarily evil, it's just not best suited for the cause that God desires for mankind to fulfill. And so because of that, Cain is gone. He's off somewhere else. He's exiled. He can't be around Adam and Eve and the other members of the human race at this point. And so since Cain is no longer there, he's treated as though he's not an offspring, not a seed. And so isn't that interesting? Even though he is the biological child of Adam and Eve, they are treating him as though, because of his punishment and exile, that he is not part of that family, and that they're going to need another heir in order to bring forward the seed that God has a plan for. And I also do want to point out before we move on, did you notice that seed is singular in both of these stories? Now, we know that Adam and Eve had other children. We know that from other passages in the scripture. And we know that when he talks about the seed of Eve, well, Eve, her name literally means the mother of all. And so she doesn't just have one child. I mean, in one sense, every single one of us sitting here are the sons and daughters of Eve if you go back far enough. And yet, the word seed is singular. Why? That seems to me to indicate that this prophecy is about a single individual, not a litany of good people or a lineage of good people that is going to happen after Eve. And so when she talks about a new offspring, it's always done in the singular in the Genesis narrative. So I think we can gain some insight too by looking into the New Testament and looking at the person who is eventually going to fulfill this prophecy. So let's go to the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 42 through 45. Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks it from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me." So, based on this, and based on other things we know from other passages in the scripture, who is Jesus the seed of? Right, so he is in that righteous lineage that is being talked about. Just like Scott was saying, for those of you who may not have heard, he's the seed of Abraham, he's the seed of David, and based on Genesis 3, he's the seed of Eve as well. And so he is, as his name that he often uses would imply, the Son of Man. He is the righteous offspring of Eve. But that's not the only parent that Jesus has, is it? Who else? Okay, I mean, in a more direct sense, yes, Mary and Joseph. I would probably include them in the righteous seed, though. Exactly. I mean, I know that that's an obvious question, but it's the right one. Like Brother Bob was saying, God was his father. And so Jesus is the seed of both the righteous lineage that we're talking about here and also God. He's the Son of God, and he talks about that right here in this particular passage. And so he's both. He's not just one or the other. He is both the offspring of God and the offspring of the sons of men. And so he contrasts that with talking about who the Pharisees are the seed of. Well, they're the children of the devil. You know, we always talk about, and almost humorously, him talking about people being a part of a generation of vipers. And granted, that is a good singer. I agree with that, but I don't think you can beat "You're the son of the devil." I mean, that's pretty difficult to have to deal with here. And so there's an indication in this passage, because remember, the Pharisees are also the offspring of Noah, the offspring of Abraham. They're, in a sense, what you would think would be part of that same righteous lineage too, and yet Jesus says they're not. In fact, he goes as far as to say that they are the seed of the devil. If that is the case, then I think that we can rightly conclude that who you are the seed of is not determined by your genetic lineage, but the way that you behave and the way that you live your life and the things that you do. And notice what he attributes to them here. I'll just pose that question to you. What are the character traits that he attributes to the devil in this passage? Liar, okay, that's one of them. Murderer, that's another one. And there's one more. This one's kind of hidden. You're right, he has an animosity towards the truth. So those are the character traits that we see of Satan. And it's also important to note that those things are also derived from this idea of where he says that they do his desires. In other words, the Pharisees are doing the desires of the devil. And so we see all the same elements that we see in the Cain story. Because what did Cain do? Murdered his brother. What did he do right after it? He lied about it. And why did he do it? Because sin desired him, and he acted upon that desire. And so we're seeing a lot of parallels between this passage and Jesus' description of the Pharisees and the way that Cain behaves. And so I think the conclusion that we can draw here is that Cain is the offspring of the serpent, not the offspring of Eve that is predicted in Genesis 14 and 15. And then Abel and Seth, and eventually Noah, are actually her true offspring that will bring forth the offspring of the Messiah. And so it is the way that a person lives their life that determines who your father is, not just your genetic traits and the person that you were born of. And we're going to see that eventually Seth is the one that his lineage produces Noah. So let's go ahead and look at Genesis 6:5, and this is the start of the Noah narrative. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So like I just said, Noah is the descendant of Seth. And so we're seeing that righteous lineage continue on that will eventually produce the Messiah. Now again, it's a contrast between the righteous seed and the evil seed. So we're seeing a continuation of that theme that was started in Genesis 3. And then interesting to know that the wicked grieved God, and yet God is about to destroy them. Now, I'm not saying that this is a fulfillment of Genesis 3. I'm not suggesting that at all. But there is kind of a precursor here to where the wicked have grieved God. In other words, they've inflicted harm and injury on him in some sense. Maybe not physical injury like we would think of, but he is about to destroy them. So in a sense, they've bruised his heel and he's going to bruise their head. That's just sort of a precursor to the ultimate fulfillment of that in the Messiah. So let's go ahead and look at some of the parallels between this and the flood narrative, because we all know what happens. The wicked are destroyed. Noah is able to, when the ark rests, he's able to go out and plant a vineyard. And then there's this whole episode with his sons. And so because of that, we're going to see some parallels between this story and the Genesis 3 prediction as well. First of all, starts in a garden. We know the first thing that the verbiage that it actually uses for Eden is it says that God planted a garden. And we see the exact same verbiage used when we see the Noah story, is that Noah leaves the ark, he sees the dry land, he plants a vineyard. That's the first thing that he does. We also see an abuse of God's created fruit. Now, this was just a misuse of good fruit rather than good and evil fruit existing in the garden, but either way, there is a parallel there where Noah abuses the fruit and the blessing that God has given to him in the form of grapes and uses it to do something evil, which is he gets himself drunk. And then there's shameful nakedness that has to be covered. And we see this in both stories. Of course, they create garments out of fig leaves, and then God eventually creates pelts and creates tunics for them out of different animals. And we see the same covering of this shameful nakedness, the nakedness of sin, having to be covered up later on in Noah's story as well. Noah's drunk. Because of that, he gets naked. And because of that, his sons have to go in and cover up his nakedness to keep shame from him. We also conclude with the contrast of the two seeds. Again, we're seeing this theme play itself out. We see the good seed that is being predicted in Genesis 3:15, and then we also see a good seed being predicted in Genesis 9:25 through 27, a blessing that is conveyed upon the sons of Noah, and we're actually going to look at that here in just, we'll go ahead and look at that right now in Genesis 9:23 through 27. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he saw what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers." And also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So again, Canaan, the son of Ham, the son that has defiled his father and looked upon his nakedness, we're seeing this pattern happen. And remember, Moses is writing all of these narratives, and so this is planned. So we're seeing this pattern being reused by God and by Moses over and over again in the Pentateuch. And there's an implication there that we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us, and so we don't want to speculate, but there was some kind of misconduct that had happened here beyond just seeing his father's nakedness. That may have been enough for it, but just like Cain, there is just this sort of language surrounding it of sexuality and sexual desire as well. And so that's associated with the evil seed and allowing that to take over and that temptation to take over you. And it's contrasted with the good seed, the two sons that actually saw their father in his shame and sought to cover that up and protect him from that. So again, it is morality, not genetics, that determine whether someone is a part of this good seed or this evil seed. And so because of that, that really determines whose child you are, because all three of these people are the sons of the same man and woman, and yet there is a contrast made in the scripture between the good seed and the evil seed. And understanding this pattern, if you really dig into these three stories, it helps you understand the pattern that is being set by 3:15. If you see all that and still believe that there is some kind of just, throwaway line in Genesis about snakes not being good and humans not liking them, or this just being about a sort of generic battle of good and evil, it's because a person doesn't fully understand the context of what is going on here in the Genesis narrative that will eventually give way to the understanding of the Messiah. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and turn to a new development that happens in this continuing story in Genesis 22, verses 15 through 18. So this is a little bit later in the narrative of the life of Abraham. He's already had his name changed. At this point, he's already had the promised son Isaac. Ishmael is already there. And again, That's another continuation of this theme, the good seed versus the unworthy seed. So Ishmael, who's not necessarily presented as a bad guy, he is not the promised seed of Abraham. And so we're continuing that mentality. And then we see this story where the son that Abraham has been waiting for all these many long years, God commands him to sacrifice him. He is to put to death the true seed and the true heir of God's blessing that he was promised all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. And so Isaac has to walk up this mountain and carry wood on his back for his own sacrifice, and then allows himself to be bound by his father, and Abraham is about to kill him. We're all familiar with this story. And yet God stops him and provides a ram to take his place. Now, again, I want to stay more focused on the actual prophecies, not just the symbolism and parallelism that happens in the Bible, which the Old Testament is replete with. But I do want you to think about this. In this story with the binding of Isaac, we have a young man who is the son of Abraham, and the promised child has to walk up a mountain with wood on his back. And this is actually the same mountain that the crucifixion takes place on. If you know your geography and you know what the Bible is describing, this is likely the exact same mountain that the crucifixion takes place on. And he had to carry wood on his back up the mountain. Now, some people will look at that and say, well, Isaac is clearly the symbol of Jesus. I would actually argue no. The ram is the symbol of Jesus because Isaac was spared. Jesus was not. He was the sacrifice that was given. And then people will point to the wood that was on his back and being, see, that's Isaac modeling Jesus and walking up the mountain. Except if you know your scripture, you know that Jesus didn't carry the wood up the mountain. He carried wood part of the way. But then another man, a man who was not condemned, Simon, is actually the one that carried the cross up the mountain. And so then we have a ram whose head is surrounded by thorns because he's caught in a thicket. He actually becomes the sacrifice so that Abraham doesn't sacrifice his own son. And seeing this, God gives this reaction in Genesis 22, verses 15 through 18. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and as the sands which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So this is an obvious foretelling of the coming of the Messiah. After we've seen all this messianic symbolism happen and played out in real time right before Abraham, then this prediction of the true fulfillment of all of this takes place, where God declares that through the seed of Abraham, that is going to take place to where all nations of the earth are blessed. Now, I love the story of Isaac. Isaac is probably, just to be honest, if you're looking at the Genesis narrative, he's probably the most moral and well-behaved out of all the patriarchs. Because as much as we admire, and rightly so, Abraham and Jacob, they got quite a few character flaws. Isaac's really one of the only ones that it doesn't really say much bad about Isaac. And so because of that, as much as I love Isaac, he doesn't bless all the nations. I mean, yeah, he's a great character, and there are people that I guess you could say are blessed through his story, but he's not the one that actually brings that blessing to all the people of mankind. It is Jesus that actually does that. It is he who creates the righteous seed. And as we've seen, both from the Gospel of John and from the stories that we've looked at tonight, it is your behavior and the things that you do, and the way that this passage reads, the people who have obeyed the voice of God, they are the seed. They are the children of God, not just the people that happen to be in the lineage of Abraham. Now, Jesus is going to be in that lineage too, of course. But the implication, the lesson that we're supposed to take away from this is, it is your behavior and the way that you act and the way you obey God's voice that makes you part of his family and one of his children, not your genetic bona fides or pedigree. And then ultimately in the book of Genesis, we see this whole prophecy come to a head and sort of foreshadowing that's going to continue after this in Genesis 49, verses 8 through 12. Now, for full context, This is Jacob after the whole episode that has happened with Joseph. They're reunited. They're in Exodus, or right before the Exodus. They are in Egypt at this point, and Jacob is blessing the grandchildren and children that have come before him. And this is the prediction that he gives for Judah. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches, he lies as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall be the obedience of the peoples. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the colt of the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth white with milk. And so this is the prediction that we have going forward, going into the Exodus narrative, that it is through Judah that the staff of rulership is going to come. Now, up until this point in that story, you might have assumed that that was going to be through Joseph, and Joseph, his sons do get a great blessing as well. But even back then, Jacob prophesies that it is going to be Judah who is going to hold the scepter, and that all the people of the earth are going to bow down to him. And there's only one person that actually fits that description in all of the biblical narrative. As great as David was, and he's a son of Judah, the whole world didn't bow down to him. The scepter, the ruler's staff, ultimately belongs to Jesus Christ, and this is Jacob foretelling that. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Ever wonder where Superman gets his incredible powers? Some people say it's the yellow son of Earth, but I think it's because he subscribes to this channel and likes my videos. Now, I'm not saying that if you subscribe to my channel you'll necessarily wake up tomorrow as a super strong, nearly invincible alien, but it definitely doesn't hurt your chances.